Now, let's turn to the story. The use and hidden meaning behind emojis came into center stage in the Judicial Tribunal into sexual misconduct against Eastern Cape Judge President Selby Mbenenge. A forensic and legal linguist, shall I say, Dr. Zakira Doctorate testified that throughout his interaction with the complainant, Andiswa Mengo, Mbenenge used a great deal of emojis that were sexual in nature. Now, to help us understand how emojis can be in a legal case, I'm joined by Sibongile Ndashe, an attorney and executive director at the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa. So, Sibongile, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this afternoon. The use of emojis has become a commonplace in everyday communication. Has this created obstacles in litigation?
No, actually, because it's another form of evidence, right, that needs to be considered. And as we saw in this case, when Dr. Doctorate was stating her qualification as a legal linguist, there aren't a lot of people who have got this expertise. I think they were counting around 10 people in the entire country. So it is an emerging area that the legal profession has to, deal with. And I think many people who were watching this evidence, we look at emojis every day, right? But to have people who have really studied this and have got expertise and they're able to help a tribunal place emojis in their proper context was quite impressive.
Now, how do you decipher this? Because the emojis, as we are learning, of course, are quite contextual in their nature, right? And doesn't always mean the same thing. Not only that, they look different based on the device that you're using. So how are you able to decipher, beg your pardon, the context in a case?
So what was quite helpful, about her evidence in contextualizing emojis, because what the evidence leader is trying to get to is the main question of this inquiry, are we seeing sexual innuendo? Is this unwanted, attention? Is this conduct unwanted? Does it cross the line, from flirtation to sexualization, of that? So what Dr. Doctorate did says we cannot look at the emojis in isolation. What she's able to decipher from looking at them is that there is a continuum of the conversation between these two people, right? And she just says that there are instances where it is flirtatious and then you can see it crossing, the line. And what is interesting is also where her evidence is not necessarily consistent with what the complainant said. And this is about what you are asking also, how different people may look at emojis, in different ways. So in her main testimony, the complainant had talked about a day when she was unwell. And then the judge said he could come and give a booster and then put an emoji of a syringe. And her understanding was that this syringe was something like a medical intervention because she was unwell. And Dr. Doctorate says when you look at the context of the conversation and the kind of syringe that the judge president was talking about, that this was no innocent, medical intervention, but the booster was basically sexual innuendo. So even though the complainant did not read it as such, but because of her expertise, and when she locates it in this kind of context, that this is what it could mean. Yeah. But at the end of the day, she considered that what's important is what the complainant kind of understood. But objectively, this is what the syringe could mean, under these circumstances.
So in sexual abuse cases or sexual harassment cases of this nature, is this not going to present disputes? For example, a smile can be an expression of happiness, an expression of approval, but also a smile can be sent in a sarcastic and patronizing context.
Well, what happens here is that, and I think that was the most important point of this evidence, it's that you cannot just look at a smile, right, on its own and make a decision about what that smile, meant. And so the people in this line of work, these experts who are looking at emojis, are saying, let us look at them in the proper, context. And so she was going through, kind of them, especially the ones where she was seeing these sexual innuendos and explaining, using her expertise, why this can or could be read, in that particular context. So it's not just they're going to throw an emoji and say, are you smiling here because you're happy, or are you kind of being condescending? Is just like any other kind of evidence that we've seen, in the past, whether it was written or whatever it is that needed to be contextualized. It's just this is another form of communication that all of us have to be careful about when we use emojis, especially people who use emojis in this kind of context, because I would imagine that the judge understood that some of the things that he was texting were improper.
Yeah.
And if that's not what he meant, as a man of his caliber or anyone in that position, to really think about how these emojis could be read.
So what specific line of questioning could here help garner the correct context?
The correct context here, so what I mentioned earlier on is what this tribunal has to understand, they are investigating, and it's whether this attention was unwanted conduct. So we are seeing here in the WhatsApp messages, right? Sometimes encouraging, the judge, like what they are talking about. And the context here is it does happen a lot with victims of sexual harassment, especially when there is an abuse of power or these kind of power differentials, where people look like they are going along with it. And this is what Dr. Docrat actually kind of says as well in her testimony, that it looks like she's going along with it, but it can be a sign of a person who's uncomfortable, doesn't know how to make it stop. So that the best way, is not to appear aggressive or not responding in the way that the person who is in power expects her to respond. So in this way, this should not be read as kind of welcome conduct, because we are looking at an abuse of power. And clearly, when you're talking about a judge's secretary and a judge president of a division, there is it's the power differentials is quite high. So those are some of the things that needs to be interpreted and understood by the tribunal, that when people were exchanging emojis, but these emojis from the most part were coming from the judge president, did they cross, the line? If she was flirting, was this because she was welcoming it or because of those circumstances? And from Docrat's evidence, she is basically saying this is a person who is not necessarily consenting, to this conduct, right, but basically someone who is struggling about the best way to kind of respond based on her positionality.
I suppose then that leads to the question, how much weight does the court then put on emojis as evidence in making decisions?
I mean, it's not the emojis themselves, right? So it's, in any kind of case, a court will look at the totality of the evidence. So in this week, there were 6 witnesses, that were called. We had the digital forensic expert, Francois Mola, and what was important about that, it was the scale of the WhatsApp messages that were exchanged by these 2 people, right? And the nature of them. And then the emojis is Dr. Zakira Docrat, who then comes in to explain the emojis as a new form of evidence that a tribunal have to look at. But there have been people like Denim Khokwana, who talks about when the mediation, that broke down, There's Abongile Chete, Kutlwano, Moretwa, all of them like former staff of the Department of Justice who work there in that division who were called in. So it's not just the emojis, that are going to determine this case, but it's part of the entire evidence that's going to be looked at. I mean, the other witness who came in said she showed me some of the sexual explicit, messages, and so this was Ntombotolo Jobela evidence. So all of these things, when read, together, that's what the tribunal will have to decide on.
Going forward, I mean, what does this mean? Emojis, are they legally binding or otherwise significant in matters of litigation?
Yes. Just like any kind of evidence is important for the purpose that it is required, for. So it's about what is this evidence of? If we are talking about fraud, is we can look at the bank transaction, and then see, did you expect this money? How did you come into this money? So if we are trying to ascertain what was said between two parties, and emojis is what was used, then that's going to be important. But I think the one thing when we are looking at emojis and just WhatsApp, this form of communication that many people use today, what was important was what happened to the first witness, which is Francois Moller, because if you remember, at the end of the first hearing, beginning of the year, it was whether the judge president had shared a picture of his penis. And so here, the expert said, I could not find, this evidence, and not because it was not shared, because some of them were deleted, from these mobile devices. So extracting evidence from WhatsApp messages is one of the things that may be a bigger challenge, than emojis, about what it is that can be retrieved when we are looking at evidence of things that are shared via WhatsApp.
Now, having said that, I mean, you said there are about, 10 experts or so in the country that are able to interpret this contextually. So do we have the right review skills in our courts, therefore?
It's an emerging kind of area of evidence. And just like anything else that is new, it will have to be tested. And that's why we've got a defense, lawyers, because just like any evidence, like DNA, for example, when it started, people would look at it and say, no, this is what's prejudicial about this form of evidence, challenge it in this way, that this is how it should have been handled, So as an emerging area of evidence that's going to be used by the courts, we are going to have to test whether it is fit for purpose, whether there is a party that is prejudiced, or whether it takes the administration of justice to the next level.
Sibongile Ndashe, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for your intervention and joining us this afternoon.